Hey everybody, nice to see you. I'm the tiniest bit late. I was riding a city bike, which is a new experience for me, but since I've been here with my friend Chris, he has illuminated me to the wonders of city bike. So that's pretty cool. If you don't know what that is, Citibank, City Corporation. They let you, pay $90 a year and use bikes, ride them all over the city. You know, when you need to get someplace. It has been interesting, though, being back. Hello, Sandeman's Live. Nice to have you. Welcome to Little Italy. Where was I? Oh, yeah. It's been interesting to be back in the city and feel all the old feelings come up. Get out of my way! That one. Hi again. Hi, Diana. Nice to see you. What else? What other ones? Why are you going so slow? That feeling, you know that one. Do something! All those sidewalk feelings that you get. Hello. Hi, Adriana. Hi, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you. It's really a neat thing. I mean, this is new to me, this live streaming business, but I think we're onto something. I think it might be a lot of fun. I hope you had a good time with me on the bridge yesterday. I had a good time with you. Thanks. And today, just to set it up, is going to be a little different, maybe a little slower. I seem to be in a much more mellow mood. This neighborhood is much calmer than being out on the bridge with a million people. And we get to talk about one of my favorite, hi Michelle, hi Michaela, nice to see you. One of my favorite subjects in the world, which is broadly the people in history who get forgotten about, who get left behind, who don't get the proper credit. The people's history, if you will, which if you've read Howard Zinn or heard about that movement that started in the 70s, and has really grown to today, you know, it's the opposite of the great man theory of history. Hi, Camila. Camila is joining us today, and I just want to give a shout out to her because it is actually her idea. It was her idea several years ago for this tour to exist. So she is the reason that I even know any of these stories or took the time to figure them out for International Women's Day. I can't remember what year it was, 2016 maybe, 2017. We decided it would be an amazing gift to give to some people, mostly women, some men in there too, to go seek out some stories, do some story hunting, and find out who were some of the great women in New York City's history. And it turns out, unsurprisingly perhaps, there's a lot, and they're very impressive. So we're excited to talk about a lot of them. What's that? Going on February 2022. You're going to be in New York. Amazing. Good for you, Adriana. Have you been here before? Let me know in the chat. And just a reminder, all the usual stuff. Please make comments. I'm trying out this thing of having this be much more casual and not so much. Obviously, I'm going to try and tell you some good stories and to illuminate some of the experience of New York through the years. But I'm also here to just hang out. It's also a walk through New York with me. So ask me questions, make comments. If you have strong feelings about people's history, about women, feel free to shout out a strong woman in your life. Amazing, Adriana. Good for you. We'll make sure and write to us, and we'll give you some tips about whatever it is you're interested in. Cocktails, dance performances, cool bookstores, art galleries, cannoli, whatever you like. And we'll put together a little list of recommendations for you for when you get here. So Thank you, Camila. I'm excited too about this tour. It was exciting to revisit some of these stories and find some new stories, to add some women's stories to this. I actually got to read an entire graphic novel by a cartoonist named Peter Baggy, who's best known for a strip called Hate, but he's a very funny cartoonist about one of our subjects today, a woman named Margaret Sanger, who is a little bit controversial, and if you were to Google her, you would find out why. She had some questionable associations, either with certain groups or with just schools of thought. But I figured for today's purposes, men get to be imperfect, hypocritical, sometimes downright irresponsible and dastardly. Why shouldn't women? All right. Well, I'm going to try and keep it to a relatively tight hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. But feel free, hello Michelle, nice to have you, to keep asking questions, make comments, and obviously, as always, if you enjoy yourself today, if you feel enlightened, illuminated, or otherwise excited by anything that we do on the tour, feel free to tip. My PayPal should be in the description below. All right, I'm gonna flip around and we are gonna head to Old St. Patrick's Cathedral just behind me. All right, see you in a second. All right, so zooming in, we are in the United States of America, the state of New York, the Empire State, Excelsior, which means ever higher is our motto. And more specifically, we are on the island of Manhattan. And even more specifically, we are in what is now called Nolita, which means north of Little Italy. And we are looking at Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. A lot of you are probably familiar with Young St. Patrick's Cathedral, New St. Patrick's Cathedral, whatever the opposite would be of that. That is the one up on Fifth Avenue, but this is Old St. Pat's Basilica, and some of you may also recognize that from a little movie called The Godfather. It is where the baptism scene in The Godfather takes place, but we are not here to talk about The Godfather, nor any other fathers. Not necessarily true, but we are here to talk about our first powerful woman on today's tour. Her name is Elizabeth Ann Seton. And Elizabeth Ann Seton was a member of this church. If you have taken our downtown tour, you may have seen her home, which is right next to Battery Park and has been preserved from the 1770s, which is where she grew up. She was born in 1774, and her name was Elizabeth Bailey. She married a man named William Seton at age 19, and after he died, she went traveling. I'm whispering because I'm in a church. She went traveling in Italy, where she fell in love with the religion of Catholicism. And when she returned home, she decided to devote her life to service in the Catholic order. Let's see if we can sneak in here. She moved down to Maryland and opened the first Catholic girls' school in the United States. Let's take a look here. It's a beautiful old cathedral. And she then founded a Catholic religious order called the Sisters of Charity, which did a lot of service work. It established orphanages and hospitals and heavily promoted the parochial school system. So Catholic schools for girls under the crazy assumption that girls should be educated as well as boys. And in honor of all of this work, the Catholic Church in 1975 decided that oh, hi, Kristen. We are at old St. Patrick's Cathedral down on Mott Street. We are talking about, hi Kristen, we are talking about Elizabeth Ann Seton, whom I was just saying in the 1970s became the first American saint. So we assign for inclusion in the catalog of saints in heaven Elizabeth Ann Seton, a society belle, a wife, a mother, and religious foundress. There we go. That's her, lady number one. I'll give you one more pretty view of the nave there, and then we'll go ahead and move on. The reason I wanted to start in this beautiful cathedral was A, because I was missing seeing things like this in New York. I don't know how everyone feels about churches. As far as touring goes, I know you all are seasoned travelers, but I had this amazing tour one time in New York where a middle-aged man from Norway was taking my Midtown tour, and I brought him to St. Patrick's Cathedral, and just as we were about to walk through the door, he said to me, "You know what, Ryan, I've been all over the world, and every city I go to, every tour guide is showing me their churches. Never once, to be honest with you, have I gotten off an airplane in a new country and said, 'Where are the churches? Get me to the churches!' So if you don't mind, we can skip it." And I thought that was hilarious, and that stuck with me, although every once in a while, as a tour guide, you're gonna have to take people to see some churches. So tell me in the chat how you feel about it when tour guides take you to churches on tour. Does anybody love it? Does anybody hate it? Does anyone think that we could do without it? Let me know in the chat. Yeah, I thought that man was very funny. It is a beautiful one, Diana. And I mean, the other St. Patrick's, I love. I always take people there, and there's always cool stories to tell people. Thank you, Kristen. I agree. There's always cool stories to tell people, but I do understand that it can get to be a lot of stuff. Let me show you a picture. I forgot. Oh, good, Diana. Good to know. All right, then maybe that Norwegian man was bitter about something else entirely, and it had nothing to do with our lovely churches here in New York. I forgot that I have the capability of showing you pictures. We took some time and uploaded some pictures to, we are walking north, by the way, on Mott Street right now. And this is sort of the remnants of what was once Little Italy. Now we call it Nolita. So you may see the occasional Peroni and a slice. We are walking towards Houston Street. So, sorry, we have multimedia capabilities in effect today, and I'm very excited about them. Let me show you a picture of Elizabeth Ann Seton, because she was quite lovely. There's a beautiful portrait of her, and I'm figuring out how to share. There we go. That is Elizabeth Ann Seton. Churches, Rebecca says, have lots of art and architectural history, so I'm always down. It's true. I mean, whether we like it or not, it's just like looking at paintings. There's, huge periods of our history where all of the money and resources were being devoted to religion, so you can't really study the history of painting without getting some religious iconography in there, and the same is true with architecture, right? Yeah. Yes, she is pretty. All right. So nobody's shouting out any powerful women in their lives. I want to hear about it. I'll get the ball rolling here. I'm going to shout out my grandmother. My grandmother. That's how much I feel about it. I am going to say my grandmother, Eulalia Kalalang, on my mother's side, was how do I get rid of my friend here? There we go. Was an incredible, powerful, funny little woman, only about 5 foot tall, like maybe a lot of our grandmothers, Filipino lady, who in the 1940s, during World War II, when the Japanese invaded Manila. She had several members of her family murdered in cold blood. Her mother was bayoneted in the stomach at her front door. And so my grandmother, with her husband and 4 children under the age of 5, spent several days escaping through the mountains to get to one of the other provinces where my grandfather had grown up. 4 children under the age of 5, sleeping in the woods, in the jungles, and made it out alive. So, that's my grandmother. All right, now it's on you. Your turn. You got to shout out a powerful woman. But we are going to take another look at one of New York's women. We are at our next stop, which I will flip around for again. This right here, you can see, is called Margaret Sanger Square. It is the corner of Mott and Bleecker Streets, and it is also the location of this Planned Parenthood. And that is fitting because Planned Parenthood is the organization that Margaret Sanger founded in a period in the history of women's rights when even talking about birth control was literally illegal. So Margaret Sanger is from upstate New York, and she watched as her mother gave birth 11 times. Well, she didn't watch. She was 8th, I believe, in order. Her mother was pregnant, though, a total of 18 times. And as you can imagine, yes, that's intense. Shout outs to anyone who's been pregnant ever. And bonus points if you've been pregnant more than 16 times. But obviously that is something we don't really try and do anymore because it was very, very detrimental to Margaret's mother's health. And it really left a deep impression on her, and she thought there's got to be a better way to do this. So she studied nursing. She became a nurse. She lived up in Westchester and White Plains. She married an architect named William Sanger, and they had a reasonable 3 children. And then they get to Greenwich Village, and everything goes crazy. Greenwich Village, if you don't know, for centuries was where you would go. I'm going to keep walking just to keep things interesting, or at least moving around, give you some nice views here. Greenwich Village for years was where you would go if you were the one weirdo, the one outlier, the one political dissident, the one revolutionary, the one artist in your small town, and you wanted to go somewhere where people thought like you, where people lived like you, where people understood you. And Margaret Sanger was rewarded by meeting folks like, like Upton Sinclair, who you may know as the author of The Jungle, which exposed the crimes and filthy conditions in the meat packing industry in Chicago. And she also hung out with people like Eugene Debs, who was one of the founders of American socialism. She also hung out with Emma Goldman, who we are going to talk about in just a moment, and is one of the founders of modern anarchism and the purveyor of such incredible quotes as, "I don't want your revolution unless I can dance to it." But anyway, Margaret Sanger got involved. She started writing. She wrote an essay called What Every Girl Should Know, and that was her first run-in with censorship. The Postal Service did not allow her to distribute that, excuse me, that essay. It would not carry the newspaper that it was being. Emma Goldman, rock on. It was not going to distribute obscenity, as it said. So these were called the Comstock laws, named after the postmaster at the time. And Margaret Sanger was furious about this, the fact that she was being censored, that she couldn't even talk about these things, much less actually be able to start helping women because she had been nursing down here in the Lower East Side, which was a heavily populated, poor immigrant neighborhood, and she had seen terrible things like back alley abortions and women having too many children and not being able to control it, and she felt like they needed help. And all she wanted to do at the very least was to inform them, was to enlighten them, was to not get hit by a car. Excuse me, there we go. I don't either, Lorraine. It was a different time, and being able to stand up for yourself and be courageous was something, but she did it with style. My favorite thing was she sent a new version of the essay to the newspaper, which said, "What every girl should know? Nothing, according to the U.S. Postal Service." And they printed it. They thought it was so clever and biting that they printed that. So Margaret Sanger went on. I'll make this quick. I realize I'm droning on and on. She started publishing her own newsletter in 1914. It was called The Woman Rebel. And then in 1923, she started the American Birth Control League, which is what we now know as Planned Parenthood. And she did live to see the invention of the birth control pill in 1960, and then died in 1966. Now, just as a caveat, she has been associated, her name has kind of been in question in more recent years because she did things like give speeches at the Ku Klux Klan Women's Auxiliary, but her justification for that was anyone who wants to hear what I have to say, I will tell them. We can argue about that if you'd like. Send it in the chat. And then she was associated with the eugenics movement, which had to do with cleansing the gene pool, which is sort of a misnomer about what she was involved in, because the fact was there was no unified eugenics movement, but things like birth control were considered a part of it. So, a little bit controversial, but ultimately incredibly brave. And if you have ever not had a baby and been happy about it, you have Margaret Sanger in part to thank. Sorry, quick stop by this awesome mural by, of course, the famous Shepard Fairey, who you may know from the Obey clothing line and the Hope posters during the Obama campaign. This is Deborah Harry, born Angela Trimble in Florida. She was adopted by the Harry family, and then eventually, as I said, she wanted to find other freaks like herself, so she came up to Greenwich Village and she formed her band Blondie, which, oh man, I keep forgetting I have these multimedia pictures there. That's her and the boys. And of course, if we have any Blondie fans in the house, give a shout out. Favorite Blondie song, anyone? Let me go, at the risk of repeating myself, I'll show you Margaret. There's Margaret Sanger real quick. Hello, Margaret Sanger. And I am actually, for the occasion, wearing my Deborah Harry t-shirt. Like a lot of people, I went through sort of a pandemic shopping phase, and one of my favorite little itches to scratch was getting cool t-shirts. So let's see it, Rye. Here we go. I am right now wearing Deborah Harry in Videodrome, which, if you haven't seen, is a wild science fiction movie by David Cronenberg, Canadian horror master, best known probably for The Fly with Jeff Goldblum. But anyway, the reason Deborah Harry's picture is here is because we are at the corner of 2nd and Bowery, which was once where CBGB was, which weirdly enough stands for Country, Bluegrass, and Blues, because they were known as the birthplace of punk rock. East 2nd Street, right there, that corner, is also known as Joey Ramone Place. And there's a funny detail about that, which is that the street sign is so high because it was the most commonly stolen street sign in New York. People kept wanting to run off with Joey Ramone Place. Ladies, we're doing a tour of the women of New York. Say hello. Woo! All right, are you New Yorkers?
Yes, we are.
Beautiful, nice to see you.
Good friends.
All right, thanks. Well, there we go. All right, what are we going with? I'm going with Ring My Bell after Heart of Glass. Sure thing. Okay. I watched the music video last night when I was doing research. I watched the music video for Rapture, which is also a great song, and I had not realized that there is a part, if you know that song, tell me about it in the chat. There is a part in Rapture where she shouts out Fab Five Freddy, who was, of course, a rapper and a graffiti artist, mostly a graffiti artist, down here in the East Village, the Lower East Side, in the early 80s. But weirdly enough, for your money, you get double value because she's shouting out Fab Five Freddy, but in the video, actually, I'm going to ask it as a trivia question. Anyone know who plays Fab Five Freddy in the Rapture video by Blondie? That's a very specific thing to ask because you have to be old enough to have watched music videos, and you have to know who several downtown New York characters are. But I know I'm with the real heads today, and I think you can handle it. I'll give you a couple minutes to guess. Here's your clue. It's another young African-American man who was hanging out in this area at the time. And that's all I got to say about CBGB and Blondie. But there's obviously a bunch of different ways to be a woman in New York. Those ladies on the steps. Margaret Sanger, Deborah Harry. Sometimes you do it because it's fun. Sometimes you do it because it's what needs to be done. So we are going to keep on moving. We are heading up Bowery right now, and just in the distance, that big brownstone building that you see, I'm going to get ahead of it, is the Cooper Union. And that was not founded by a woman. It was founded by a very, very wealthy, very philanthropic man named Peter Cooper. She didn't write Tide is High? Who wrote that song? Tell me. Is it a reggae song? Tell me, Cami. But that is a fun one. It's all really fun. You forget sometimes how much fun Blondie is, at least if you're me. But the Cooper Union is right ahead of us, and some of you may know of that. It is a famous architecture and engineering and design college, which amazingly enough, for the first, 150 years that it existed, was absolutely free, which for the Europeans, give me a break. I know that's not a big deal to you, but for Americans, it happens very, very rarely. Thank you, Chris Sandeman. It's true. It's all tying together, all your Sandeman's trivia. But where was I? Peter Cooper was a very wealthy man with very fancy facial hair. I'll show you his statue in just a second after I pan around and show you some of these other crazy, speaking of architecture, crazy, fancy new pieces of architecture. Jenny Jean, you have to be ready to meet all of those famous blonde people. It is Jean-Michel Basquiat, and I was just doing my impression of Benicio del Toro in Basquiat. You have to be ready to meet all of those famous blonde people. But yes, Jean-Michel Basquiat makes an appearance in the Rapture video. And do yourself a favor and check it out. He's such a sweet little man. He was from this neighborhood. He used to sleep in Tompkins Square Park before he became rich and famous. And then, of course, died an untimely death at the age of 27, part of the 27 Club. But more importantly, Peter Cooper is also part of the Cooper Union these days. Crazy Crazy piece of architecture there. Peter Cooper had this amazing hall where some of the most incredible speeches in history, at least in New York, were given. Most famous probably was Abraham Lincoln giving his A House Divided speech in 1863, after which, famously, Mr. Cooper took him out for a beer at McSorley's, which is right down that street, McSorley's old ale house on 7th. And Peter Cooper, thank you, Kami, the Jamaican group, the Paragons. Yeah, I knew it was a reggae song. So let's see, that's Pete. And who else spoke there? Let's see, Frederick Douglass gave an amazing speech here at Cooper Union. Barack Obama has spoken here much more recently, of course. But the one we're here to talk about today was an incredible one. It was by a tiny little Lithuanian immigrant named Clara Lemlich. And Clara Lemlich had migrated to the United States as a young lady when she was 10 years old. And she started working 11-hour days, 6 days a week, for $3 a week. She was appalled at those conditions, and so she joined the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. She started writing pamphlets. She started giving lectures. She was developing her voice. She was finding her voice, which is, I think, a lot of what this tour is about. And then one day in 1909, there were members of the ILGWU meeting in Cooper Union, and everyone was arguing about this tactic versus that tactic as far as improving conditions, getting more money for their work. And Clara Lemlich stood up, this tiny woman, and she said, you know what? We can talk and talk all day about how we're going to get things done, or we can go march. And she led the workers out into the street, up to Union Square, which is just up 4th Avenue there. And the next day, thousands of workers came out to Union Square to protest the conditions in the garment district, the garment industry in general. And over the next week, 15,000 people marched to improve workers' conditions. The Village Voice does not still exist. That sign is still up there. Sorry, Lorraine. I know. I miss it too. The sign is still up there, but you may have noticed on Bowery, the Village Voice used to be the most fun, kind of radical, cool, free newspaper in the village. It was started by Norman Mailer and a couple other folks in the 1960s. And we used to get them to find out where the cool shows were going to be and everything else that was going on in culture. But we call that the march that I'm talking about, the March of the 20,000, and it lasted for 3 months, which eventually led to reforms like shorter hours and fairer wages, which in this era, the progressive era, you really had to fight for if you wanted to get them. Now, I do realize that I skipped Emma Goldman. I was going to make a stop, but I realized it was not much to look at because it was the site of a former theater called the Thalia Theater, which no longer exists. It's a little Chinese restaurant these days. But I will take the opportunity to tell you about Emma Goldman, who was hanging out in this same era in the 1910s. She was all over New York, and she was writing and finding her voice and giving speeches. And in fact, she gave a speech up. Yeah, Lorraine. No, I know. I'm bummed. No, it doesn't exist anymore in The Voice. Up at Union Square, which is not actually named for all of the union activity that went on there. It's just the Union of 4th Avenue and Broadway. But it has seen a lot of union activity over the years. Emma Goldman gave a speech there where she, similarly, oh, let's watch him spin the cube. Do it, women of New York. There we go. This is the Alamo, as it's called. Oh, you can do it. Give it a spin. No?
I couldn't. I'm not strong enough.
You can't? Oh, let me help. Here. Will you hold this for a second? Okay. Hold on to that. And that's the microphone. And say hello. Tell us where you're from.
Oh, yeah? Oh, okay.
See? Say hello. Introduce yourself. No?
No.
We did it. Yay for women.
Okay.
All right.
Got it?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Take care. All right. I knew they could do it. Ooh. Oh, boy. Anyway, Ms. Emma Goldman, gave a speech where she said, pardon me, I'm going to look up the quote here. Okay, so this is 1893. There is a panic, which is a stock market crash, right? And all of the wages are being dropped. Workers are being exploited. And she says, well, then we will demonstrate before the palaces of the rich, and we will demand work. And if they do not give you work, demand bread. And if they deny you both, you take the bread. Just one of several great quotes by Ms. Goldman. Anyway, she got arrested for inciting a riot, and then she spent the next 10 months in a penitentiary on Blackwell's Island, which is Roosevelt Island, where we are going to take our tour this Sunday. And when she came back, her cause had been so popularized, she had become this martyr figure. As will happen, similar things happened to Margaret Sanger when she got censored, that everybody came to see her. 3,000 people went to see her speak at the Thalia Theater. And she said amazing things like, I want freedom, the right to self-expression, everybody's right to beautiful, radiant things. My other favorite quote, last one, I promise, I could do this all day. But if voting changed anything, they would make it illegal. That's Emma Goldman, the anarchist. The weirdest episode in her life, though, is when she was running an ice cream shop in Worcester, Massachusetts, as a way of funding the revolution. She and her lover, Sasha Berkman, decided that they needed to... yes, the public theater was right behind me. Is that a request, Kristen? I'll go there. You dare me? I'll go take you to the public theater if you want. Yeah, let's go. I'll take that as a dare. We'll go see the public theater. It's a cool old building. Emma Goldman, Sasha Berkman, they decided that they needed to assassinate one of the captains of industry, a man named Henry Clay Frick. And Frick, you may recognize his name from his famous art collection uptown, the Frick Collection. He was the business manager, the partner who ran the company for Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel, and he had broken a strike of his steel workers by hiring the infamous Pinkerton Security Company, who were thugs with nightsticks, to come and break up the strike, and 9 people were killed. This is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And when Emma Goldman and Sasha Berkman, running their little ice cream shop in Massachusetts, heard about that, they knew they had to do something. So they bought a revolver. Berkman set up a business meeting with Frick, and then he attempted to assassinate him. Unfortunately, Sasha was sort of an intellectual and not much of a murderer. So he shot Berkman 3 times. None of them were very effective. He stabbed him in the leg, and then Frick's security came in and beat Sasha Berkman to a pulp. and he had to spend the next 22 years in prison. Excuse me, ma'am. All right, Kristen. There's the Public Theater. I'll tell you a little bit about that. Anyway, Emma Goldman, just to finish up with her, she was eventually kicked out of the country. She was deported by none other than J. Edgar Hoover, a very young J. Edgar Hoover in 1919, who would, of course, go on to head the FBI for the next 5 decades. But she said that she could not be prouder to be the first political dissident deported from the United States for her beliefs. It seems like there comes a time where you just have to stop hiding. You have to stop compromising. You have to stop letting other people's visions and other people's demands of you hold you down. And I love that every woman we talk about on this tour had to do that. There's some moment where she says, that's it. I've had enough. I'm not going to do it anymore. And Emma Goldman, when she gave her first speech up in Rochester, trying not to get hit here, she heard her soul's song. She has a beautiful passage that she writes about hearing herself speak. She had had a lot of stage fright before that, and she all of a sudden heard her voice loud and clear and knew what she had to do with her life. She ended up leaving her husband, her first husband, soon after and coming down to the village to hang out with all these other radicals. Anyway, this was once the Astor Library. I was speaking about the library earlier on, and John Jacob Astor, of course, is a very famous, wealthy man who made his fortune in beaver pelts. If you go downstairs at the Astor Place subway station, you can see that there are beaver in the tiles to celebrate Mr. Astor's top product. And this was his library, his private library, which he then donated and became the public library before it was consolidated with the Tilden Trust and the Lenox Library and moved up to Fifth Avenue. And now it is the Public Theater, where shows like Hamilton make their debuts. Also, the Public is the theater company that puts on Shakespeare in the Park every summer. Cool stuff. All right, let's head back down Astor and over. How we doing? Hanging in there? Everybody okay? I'm gonna say hi for a second. And hi. Sorry, I'm a face guy. I'm still getting used to live streaming, especially the part where I don't get to make eye contact with you. So, I wrote in my notes this morning, I said, maybe every 20 minutes, say hello. Let them see your face. Let them know you're still a person, not a robot. Thanks, Diana. I love these stories as well. Yeah, I find them incredibly inspiring. And yeah, tell me in the chat, how do you think we're doing as far as equality goes? We never passed the ERA. That doesn't exist. I mean, all of these stories are about rights, right? They're about that core American promise that all men, supposedly means people, are created equal. And so all of these stories, it's not women's history. It's ridiculous that I have to call it women's history, honestly. Tell me if you agree. It's ridiculous that it's not just history, that we're still having to fold that back in for the Schitt's Creek fans out there. We have to fold it in. We have to fold in the women's history and still have to think of it as a separate, specialty item that isn't associated with regular history. I think it's preposterous. But we're doing that work. And so many inspiring stories by so many incredible people. Well, I'm going to show you some pictures of. Who do we got? There's Emma Goldman. I'm actually going to hang out in Jersey tomorrow. Where's my face? There, Emma. with my friend Dan, who named his daughter after Emma Goldman. He named her, he and his wife, naturally, he named her Emma Simone as a reference to Emma Goldman and Simone de Beauvoir, the author of The Second Sex. Another amazing, amazing woman. Unfortunately, didn't spend too much time in New York, as far as I know. So that's Emma. Get out of here. All right. Oh, thanks, Kristen. Appreciate it. Yes, Jeanette. I bought my lady friend. You can buy these wooden spoons that say "fold in the cheese." They sold me that on Instagram, and I had to get it because she's a big Schitt's Creek fan as well. Who did I miss? Clara. Where's Clara? Oh, there's tough little Clara Lemlich. They all have these set jaws. I feel like they all kind of have to have this stern look in their face. Because there's a lot to deal with. I mean, you left your country, whether that was the Ukraine or Lithuania or Ireland or anywhere else, to come to the land of opportunity. You left because you couldn't make any money, or you were being persecuted, or things were desperate, or there was a famine. And then you got here and you were forced to work in these terrible conditions, but I don't like to go crazy in the patriotism department, but you could do things like protest. You could do things like organize. You just still had to have the smarts and the will and the courage to be able to do it. Like, who's next? A woman named Pauline Newman. So we are walking over by New York University right now. Some of you know that, on 8th Street. In the Village, just north of Washington Square Park, which is where we are going to finish our tour in about 10 minutes. So, Pauline Newman also immigrated from, I'm going to get this wrong, I believe it was Lithuania as well. And she, sorry about that, as a child, she started working at the very famous, for the wrong reasons, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which we are just around the corner from right now. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a horrible sweatshop where women were locked in so that they had to ask to take a break, which they could not do. They had to ask to use the restroom. They were working similarly 12-hour days, 6 days a week, making about $3 a week. About less than that, $1.50 a week or so. And so she joined the Socialist Literary Club and quit the Triangle in 1909. And she and Clara were both members of the International Ladies Garments Workers Union. So they organized those rallies, like the Rally of the 20,000, together. And then she was nominated for Secretary of State by the Socialist Party of New York when she was still a teenager. And then she was traveling around the country organizing when she heard in Philadelphia about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. There's one more stop. I had to change the route a little bit. There is one more stop we're going to make, which is before we get to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and then Washington Square Park, which is right over here. right here on 8th Street, is where the original Whitney studio was. Now, if you went on the High Line with Chris, or on your own, as people do sometimes, you know that the Whitney Museum is down at the bottom of the High Line now. And it used to be over on the east side, the Upper East Side, for years. And prior to all of that, it was down here on 8th Street, right where you see Cantor Film Center on that block right in front of us. The actual building doesn't exist anymore. But Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who, yes, oh, thank you, Lorraine, I really appreciate that, very kind of you, was, as she sounds, a very wealthy young lady. She was the great-granddaughter of the famous Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who founded the Staten Island Ferry and then the railroads here in New York. And Gertrude was his wacky granddaughter, who was a socialite and then became an artist, and it was all over the newspapers that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, this heiress, was going to be living in a dingy alley down in Greenwich Village with the bohemians and the freaks and the weirdos and the homosexuals. But Gertrude didn't care. She was an artist, and she knew where she wanted to be. Now, she did have a tough time making it as an artist because, A, people did not take her seriously. They thought she was a dilettante, a dabbler, that she was just messing around with daddy's money. So she had to use an alias. She used a man's name as an artist for years, but she became an incredible sculptor. She went and studied with Auguste Rodin in Paris, who told his friends and associates to keep an eye on her, oh hey Tage, that she was going to be a big deal. And so she hung out down here on 8th Street, and she started inviting and buying up, she started having salons and studios with her fellow painters and sculptors, and then she started buying up their art. She amassed this gigantic collection of incredible art. Sorry, I'll just give you a little gander around. We're heading down 5th Avenue right now. And she had about 700 pieces that in 1929 she tried to donate to the Metropolitan Museum, and amazingly enough, they turned her down. They said, "We are not interested in American art, and anyone who is must be some kind of cretin." And so Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney said, well, then I guess I'll have to start my own museum. And the Whitney Museum specializes in American art. And it started, even though she was willing, unbelievable, right? She was willing to buy an entire wing for the Met to house this collection of American art. It was so looked down upon at the time that she had to open her own museum, which she gladly did over there on 8th Street. And one more thing I want to point out, Michaela, thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's very kind of you. Was that she was a wonderful sculptor, and I can't just keep saying that without showing you some of her work. And one of my favorite things, which I believe, I don't have any proof of this, that James Cameron may have seen as well, is her tribute to those who died on the Titanic. This lives in Washington, D.C. And this beautiful statue with arms outstretched may remind you of a certain scene in the biggest movie of 1997. She was a student of Rodin's, yes. And he was a big fan of hers. He really thought that she was a great sculptor and that she was doing really beautiful work. And I hope you agree. So, Tage, what are you saying? Of the Washington Square Arch? No, not at all. This is, I don't actually know when the arch in Paris is from. Let me get rid of, there we go. But I believe this one should be much later. This was built for the centennial of George Washington's inauguration. So 1889 is when this was built. And we are just about coming to the end of Diana. Thank you so much. Incredibly kind of you. I really appreciate it. Just about coming to the end of our tour. We got a few amazing women to talk about, but we are of course entering Washington Square Park, which has a long and weird history that I'll try and tell you about right now. It started out as a potter's field. Of course, in other words, that means a place to bury poor people who can't afford their own gravestones. And a lot of those were yellow fever victims. This was a swamp, and so in the 1700s, whenever a yellow fever epidemic would break out, they would just bring literally cartloads of bodies up to this swamp, and they would dump them in and then head back downtown to their nice lives where things didn't smell like bodies. Now, when they decided to make this into a park, it was originally a marching grounds for the military. So they paved it over in the 1800s, and then on the opening day, famously, it was a huge party with 200 hams and 2 fully barbecued oxen at the opening of Washington Square Park. The concrete hadn't quite settled, so some of the carts created potholes, and you could see yellow cloth poking up through the potholes from the shrouds that had been around the yellow fever victims. Always wondered, different architect then. Yes, yeah, different architect. I probably knew who that was at one point, and I could look it up, but more importantly, let's just take a gander. And that's always a nice view. It's not like I plan to end every tour with a framed view of the Empire State Building. It just happens to be a big building here in New York. The term is much more romantic than the reality. Which term, Jeanette? Which term are we talking about? Tell me more. I'd like to hear. But anyway, here we are in this gorgeous park, which has for generations supported New York's youth's skateboarding habits, as well as pot dealing habits, as well as jazz playing habits, as well as NYU students studying habits, and all kinds of other things. Oh, Potter's Field. Yes. That's a good point. Yeah, I wish they were potters. I wish it was a field full of people making pottery. That'd be much nicer. But anyway, there was a period of time when this was a potter's field where this was also where you would set up a gallows when someone had done something punishable by death. There were hangings in what is now Washington Square Park. And a lot of the ghost tours that you'll go on, they are going to tell you that this giant elm tree, which is a giant, beautiful, centuries-old elm tree in the corner of the park, is known as the Hangman's Elm. Not this one here, we'll get there in a second, is where these people were hanged from, which is not really true. It's sort of like the way that fountain in Central Park is not really the fountain from Friends, but tour guides like to say it because it makes for a good story. I get it. I like to tell a good story too. But there were hangings here. I will show you the elm tree. This was generally the area of the park where the hangings were. And the one I want to tell you about today was the last hanging in Washington Square Park. And it was in 1819. And unfortunately, it's not a happy story. I will end with a happy story, I promise. It was a 19-year-old enslaved girl named Rose Butler. Now, there's a couple of weird things. There's the Hangman's Elm. I didn't know this was closed off, this corner, for some reason. I thought I'd walk over there, but it's that big elm tree over there. Let me get a better view. And this 19-year-old enslaved girl named Rose Butler, there's the big elm tree. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. Rose Butler was hanged for arson, which at the time in New York was a crime punishable by death. But the thing I love about Rose Butler is that, honestly, there's no reason she should have been enslaved at that time. There's a weird loophole in the law where anyone born after the 4th of July, 1799, was supposed to, if they were born into an enslaved family, they were supposed to graduate out from that. And she was born in November of that year. And so she maybe never should have been an enslaved person, like no one should have ever been an enslaved person. And so the fact that she burned down her quote-unquote master's house, I feel like is maybe a fitting response to being enslaved as a 19-year-old woman with dreams and visions and goals and an intellect of your own. I would probably burn down a house as well. Anyway, that is Rose Butler, but that's a terrible way to end a tour, so I'm going to tell you one more story, which is maybe, not that it's a competition, my favorite woman in New York City's history, and certainly one of the most powerful. And her name is Jane Jacobs. I got my timing together on those pictures. How do you like that? Jane Jacobs, this funny little bespectacled journalist, from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Very bookish, not tough, not a fighter in the traditional sense. She's a small, owlish woman. She was capable of bringing down, literally, the most powerful man in New York City's history. You may have heard of him. His name is Robert Moses. And although he was never elected to office, he had more impact on the way the city looks in the modern era than any other single figure. He was started out as the head of the Parks Department and doing beautiful things like rebuilding Riverside Park. And then he got a little bit of power. He learned how to work the system. And then he started building highways and bridges and tons of infrastructure projects at the cost, of course, of the actual neighborhoods that he wanted to run those highways through. There's a couple of famous cases of this. The most famous is the Cross Bronx Expressway, where he demolished, and you can just see, if you go up to the Bronx, you can see where the Cross Bronx Expressway cuts that entire borough in half and made the South Bronx cut off from the economy there, turned it into the horrible breeding ground of poverty and crime that it became in the 1970s and 80s and has never, ever really recovered from. Now, Moses was used to getting whatever he wanted done. He could declare he was the head of 11 different committees in the city. There's a lot to say about him. There's a 1,500-page book called The Power Broker that you should check out if you have a strong lower back. But he was used to getting whatever he wanted. He was the head of 11 different committees, so he could declare a neighborhood a slum so that he could build a highway through it, right? But when he went head-to-head with Jane Jacobs, amazingly enough, he lost because she lived over in the West Village. You can still see her house. It's 555 Hudson Street. And he decided that he wanted to create an expressway going through Lower Manhattan. was going to be called the LOMEX, or the Lower Manhattan Expressway. He had this idea, which might have been nice because it's famously very hard to get from one side of Manhattan to the other. He was going to have 3 highways, the Lower Manhattan, the Midtown Manhattan, and the Upper Manhattan Expressway. And in this case, it would have cut right through Chinatown, Little Italy, Soho, and then the West Village. He also had an idea that he was going to expand Fifth Avenue to cut right down through Washington Square Park. And I would be standing on the middle of Fifth Avenue listening to the interstate, the Lower Manhattan Expressway go past me right now, and not smelling pot smoke and listening to people ramble about conspiracies in this beautiful park if it were not for Jane, who was the head of the committee to save the West Village. And she was not only an amazing writer, but she created these visual spectacles to really let people know what the impact would be on the neighborhood, on these people. She had people show up with glasses with blacked out windows to show that you aren't just condemning buildings, you're condemning people as well. She had a ribbon tying ceremony here in Washington Square Park instead of a ribbon cutting, saying things are beautiful exactly as they are. Let's celebrate what we already have, this neighborhood, this community, instead of always trying to develop. And with the help of a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, she spent 3 years writing her signature work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which was an anti-urban planning book. She talked about how cities were organic beings, that they were created by everybody, not by greedy, power-hungry men in offices. They were created by this student over here, and this sanitation worker over here, and this housewife over here. And before I finish, anyway, the Lower Manhattan Expressway obviously was not built. Washington Square Park still exists thanks to Jane Jacobs. And before I say goodbye for the day, I'm going to let Jane speak for herself. I have a little quote from her right here queued up. And I will flip this around one last time because I think it'll illustrate what I'm talking about. Under the seeming disorder of the old city, wherever the old city is working successfully, is a marvelous order for maintaining the safety of the streets and the freedom of the city. It is a complex order. Its essence is intricacy of sidewalk use, bringing with it a constant succession of eyes. This order is all composed of movement and change, and although it is life, not art, we may fancifully call it the art form of the city, and liken it to the dance. Not to a simple-minded precision dance with everyone kicking up at the same time, twirling in unison and bowing off en masse, but to an intricate ballet in which the individual dancers and ensembles all have distinct parts which miraculously reinforce each other and compose an orderly whole. The ballet of the good sidewalk never repeats itself from place to place, and in any one place is always replete with new improvisations. So that's Jane Jacobs from The Death and Life of Great American Cities. The crazy postscript to that is that she left her favorite neighborhood in Greenwich Village. She moved up to Toronto, and there happened to be a greedy, power-hungry city planning committee up there trying to destroy neighborhoods to build an expressway called the Spadina, and she shut that one down too. She just took that power, that spirit, that rebellious spirit with her wherever she went. And it's amazing to think about all of these women and what they had to go up against, these incredible systems of oppression, of greed, of, I never made it to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, you know? We'll have to save that for a pop-up. I'm so sorry. I got all excited about Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. But I will do a pop-up over there, maybe in just a minute. because that's an amazing story that kind of actually is what this is all about. Or if I'm sneaky, I'll keep doing my outro right now while I'm walking, and by the time I'm done doing my outro, we'll be at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Because that story, I'll tell you, and then we'll go over there, is of course the story of how 123 young women, mostly immigrant girls from Little Italy, they were trapped inside this building because of those locks on the doors, because of the lack of safety conditions, because of the greed and the need for control over them. So that when it caught on fire in 1912, they were not able to escape. They were not able to get safely out of the building. The fire escapes either didn't exist or they were so shoddily constructed that as soon as you stepped on them, they fell. The fire company, the fire department showed up to try and save them, and the ladders were too short to reach the upper stories, and so unfortunately women started jumping out of the windows to their death. And all told, 146 people, it was 123 women and 23 men were killed in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which is obviously a horrible tragedy, which we commemorate every year. There's a group that goes around to the homes in Little Italy of those girls and writes their names on the sidewalk on March 25th every year, which is the anniversary of the fire. But the one amazing, amazing thing to come out of that is that in addition to drawing greater attention to the horrible conditions these people were working in, Frances Perkins, who was a teacher and the head of the Consumer Advocates Bureau, she happened to be walking on this sidewalk where we are right now as this building was on fire. And she saw the horrible tragedy and the city's inability to help them save these young women. It's been rebuilt, obviously. And she went on to devote her life to improving labor conditions. She, in fact, became the first woman to be a presidential cabinet member. She worked with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president, who of course Roosevelt Island is named after, where we'll be tomorrow, as his Secretary of Labor. And she worked to improve conditions to bring more attention to the plight of the average worker, especially young women. So hopefully, that was not all in vain.
What? No, bro, he's had face me. He's had face me. Way before that. Anyway, okay, we're not.
That's our story. Clara Lemlich, Frances Perkins, Deborah Harry, we thank you for your contributions. Emma Goldman, it's true. I don't want their revolution unless I can dance to it either. So thanks for listening. I hope you learned a couple things. And I hope you remember to be grateful for how good we have it, for the fact that these incredible women fought for us, the future generations, folks who only have to work, well, some of us, 5 days a week, 8-hour days. The fact that we don't have to work in sweatshops, some of us. There's still a lot of battles to be fought, but at least they gave us some inspiration and taught us what it means to be courageous. That's all I gotta say. Diana, thank you. Camila, thank you, my dear. Sandemans, thank you for giving me the chance to tell these stories. It was a genuine pleasure and an honor. And I will be back on Sunday, and we'll go hang out on Roosevelt Island, and that should be another great tour. And thanks again for everything. Have a great day. We'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.